Hey everyone. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way YouTube will keep showing you more stories just like this one. Alright, let's get started. It was the autumn of 2020, right in the middle of that uneasy year, when I moved into a rented duplex in Bentonville, Arkansas. I was 28, newly single, and working as a night shift supervisor at a packaging facility on the edge of town. Moving out on my own was supposed to be liberating. Instead, it ended up being the most terrifying stretch of my life. The duplex itself wasn't much. One of those cookie-cutter rental properties built in the late 90s. Beige siding, cheap fences, and gravel driveways. The kind of place where the walls felt paper thin and the neighbor's TV bled faintly through the drywall if you listened closely enough. I told myself it would be temporary, a year at most, just long enough to get back on my feet after the breakup and stack some money in savings. The first 2 weeks passed quietly. My neighbors seemed normal enough, mostly older couples and a few small families. Everyone minded their own business, which I appreciated, but there was one man who immediately unsettled me. He lived 2 doors down, in the far right unit of our row. A big guy, maybe mid-40s, with a shaved head and an uneven beard. I noticed him almost every night when I came home from work. He'd be standing outside, sometimes with a cigarette, sometimes just staring across the street at nothing. He never waved, never smiled, not once. At first, I tried to brush it off. People have their quirks. Maybe he was just an insomniac. Maybe he worked nights too. But there was something about his stillness that got under my skin. He didn't shift his weight, didn't glance at a phone. He just stood there, watching. By the 3rd week, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. Until the noises started. It was a Thursday night. I'd gotten home around 11:15 p.m., microwaved some leftover pasta, and collapsed in bed. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound, a low, scraping noise, metallic and deliberate, echoing from the back of the duplex. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again. Long, slow, like nails dragging across wood. My bedroom had a sliding glass door that opened onto a small fenced patio. The sound seemed to come from there. Heart hammering, I sat up in bed and held my breath. A few seconds later, I heard the crunch of footsteps across gravel. Not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I grabbed the only thing I had near me, a dull steak knife I'd stashed in the nightstand, just in case. Feeling ridiculous but terrified, I crept to the blinds and pulled them back just an inch. Nothing. Just darkness. I called 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher was calm, almost dismissive, telling me an officer would be sent to check. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights painted the inside of my living room. 2 officers knocked on the front door. I explained what I'd heard. One of them circled around back with a flashlight. He came back less than a minute later, shaking his head. The gate was closed. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. Probably just a raccoon, he said with a half smirk. They filed a short report, told me to keep the doors locked, and left. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, when daylight finally came, I went out back to check for myself. That's when I saw it. A flat chunk of brick wedged under the gate, keeping it slightly ajar. It wasn't something the wind would have done. Someone had put it there on purpose. I kicked it across the yard and called the non-emergency police line. They said they'd update the report, but again, there was nothing they could really do. That was the first time I felt truly unsafe in that house. 2 nights later, it escalated. I woke up at 2:11 a.m. to the distinct rattle of the sliding door handle. At first, it was gentle, like someone testing it. Then harder, more insistent. Someone was trying to open it. I froze in bed, every nerve on fire. Slowly, I sat up, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 again. My voice shook as I whispered into the receiver. While waiting, I crouched low in the hallway, knife in hand. The motion-activated porch light clicked on, and through a gap in the blinds, I saw a shadow. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, standing inches from the glass. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there. When the police finally arrived, they actually found prints in the gravel leading up to the back door. Large, unmistakable footprints. But once again, because there was no forced entry, they couldn't do much. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one of the officers said. "Make sure to lock your doors." I wanted to scream at them. The next day, I bought a pair of Wi-Fi security cameras from Walmart and installed one above the front door and another above the sliding glass door. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, phone in hand, watching the live feed. Nothing happened at 2:11, nothing at 2:20. I almost let myself relax. Then, at 2:27, the alert went off. The camera caught a man slipping through the gate. He was tall, broad, and wearing a dark hoodie pulled tight over his head. He moved with precision, as if he knew exactly where to avoid the motion sensor, until the last second when the floodlight clicked on. He looked up directly into the camera and smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was slow, deliberate, stretched too wide. He stayed like that for several seconds, grinning at the lens, before slowly backing away into the shadows. I called the police again and showed them the footage. They admitted it was disturbing, but still insisted there was little they could do. No break-in, no property damage, no crime. That night, I didn't go home. I booked a cheap hotel off the interstate and stayed there. When I returned the next morning to grab more clothes, I found muddy handprints on the glass door. 4 of them, 2 pressed high, 2 crouched low, like someone had been peering in for a long time. I moved out within the week, broke the lease, lost the deposit. I didn't care. But the final straw was the note. The day I was loading the last of my boxes into the car, I checked the mailbox one last time. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper, folded in half. In small, cramped handwriting it read, "The police might leave, but I won't." My stomach dropped. My hands shook as I shoved it back into the envelope. I filed one last report, and for the first time, the responding officer actually looked disturbed. He promised they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I didn't wait to see what happened next. I left Bentonville that same evening and never looked back. 2 months later, I got a Facebook message from a woman named Rachel. She'd just moved into my old unit. Her message read, "Hi, sorry to bother you. I think you used to live here. Did you ever see a man in a black hoodie hanging around the back fence? Because I swear I keep hearing footsteps outside around 2 in the morning. Last night, someone knocked on the glass and just stood there." I never replied. I didn't want to know how her story ended. In 2019, I worked for a property preservation company out of Cleveland, Ohio. It wasn't the kind of job people dreamed about as kids, but it paid the bills. The work was simple on paper. Secure foreclosed houses, clean them out, winterize them, and keep vandals from turning them into hangouts. Most of the time it was quiet. Just me, a truck, and some gear. The houses were often shells of people's lives. Faded furniture, family photos left behind, boxes of junk no one cared enough to claim. Sometimes I'd feel a flicker of sadness walking through them, sometimes boredom. But every now and then you get a property that makes the hair on your arms stand up the second you cross the threshold. And one house in particular, I still think about it years later. It was early October when my supervisor handed me a file with an Athens County address, down near the edge of Wayne National Forest. Routine clear-out, he told me. Some middle-aged man had died alone, no heirs. House sat vacant until the bank finally repossessed it. I left Cleveland before sunrise, the highway eventually winding into narrower roads and small Appalachian towns where half the shops were boarded up. By the time I turned onto the gravel road my GPS directed me down, I'd already passed the last sign of civilization, a gas station with one working pump and a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in days. The gravel road stretched on longer than I expected, hemmed in by thick, pressing trees. And then I saw it, a one-story ranch home sitting like a dying thing at the end of the lane. The paint had peeled into long strips, ivy clawed its way up the siding, and the porch sagged as if it were sighing under its own weight. No neighbors, no traffic, just woods swallowing the house whole. I parked, grabbed my clipboard and crowbar, and made my way to the door. The air was cold, and every crunch of gravel under my boots seemed too loud. The front door had swollen in the frame, and I had to shoulder it open, wood groaning as though the house were reluctant to let me in. The smell hit me immediately. Stale, damp air tinged with something metallic like rust or blood long dried. I'd smelled mildew plenty of times, but this was sharper, heavier. Inside looked ordinary enough at first. A couch draped in a faded quilt, curtains yellowed with age, a coffee table stacked with unopened mail. But something felt wrong. It was too still, too heavy. I pulled out my phone to start taking inventory photos. No service, not even a single bar, and that's when it buzzed in my hand. Unknown caller. I froze. Out here, With no reception, I thumbed the answer button, holding my breath. At first, it was just static, a low crackling hiss, like an old radio left between stations. Then I thought I heard breathing, faint, steady. Hello? My own voice sounded too loud in the empty living room. Nothing. Just static. Who is this? The line clicked dead. I stared at the black screen, heart already drumming. Told myself it was a glitch, some freak thing with the towers. Phones did weird things all the time. I forced myself back to work. The kitchen was cluttered with rusted pans, canned goods 10 years expired, and a toaster with a melted cord. I jotted down notes, snapped photos, and moved to the hallway. The first bedroom was bare, except for a stained mattress on the floor. The second was stranger. Shelves lined with jars of screws, old thread spools, and a corkboard hanging above a desk. I stepped closer. It was covered in newspaper clippings. All obituaries, dozens of them, cut cleanly with scissors, pinned neatly in rows. None of the names meant anything to me, but they were all local. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Who pins obituaries like trophies? The third room was the master bedroom. On the nightstand sat a beige rotary phone, the kind I hadn't seen since my grandmother's house. The plastic had yellowed. The cord was frayed and trailed into the wall where the line had clearly been cut. The thing was dead. Had to be. I raised my phone to snap a picture. That's when it buzzed again. Unknown caller. Every instinct screamed not to answer. But my hand moved anyway, thumb sliding across the screen. The same static hiss, louder this time. Then beneath it, a whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. Don't answer the phone in the bedroom. The line went dead. I whipped around, scanning the room. Windows closed, door shut. The house was silent. There was no way anyone knew where I was standing. I shoved the phone into my pocket, my palms slick with sweat. Told myself again it was some prank, some fluke. But the feeling that eyes were on me from somewhere in that house wouldn't let go. I worked faster, boxing up items, jotting notes. Every floorboard creak made me spin around. Every shadow seemed deeper. And then it happened. The shrill, mechanical sound of a phone ringing. Not my phone. The rotary phone is on the nightstand. I froze. That phone wasn't supposed to work. The line was dead, but it rang again and again. The sound echoed down the hall, bouncing off the walls, drilling into my skull. I crept toward it, breath shallow, the hallway stretching like it would never end. In the bedroom, the phone rattled on the nightstand, receiver trembling with each metallic chime. I didn't touch it. I just stood there until, mercifully, the ringing stopped. The silence after felt worse. I wanted to leave, but my job wasn't finished. And part of securing any property was checking the basement. The door groaned when I opened it. A damp draft slid up my legs. The smell was stronger here, mold, rust, and something sharp like iron shavings. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped down. Each stair creaked, the sound swallowed by the dark. The basement was cluttered, shelves stacked with paint cans, a broken chair, and old storage boxes. And in the far corner, a small wooden table. On it sat a gray cordless phone, an early 2000s model. Its surface was layered in dust, but a faint green light glowed from the base. Beside it was a stack of notebooks, yellowed and warped from damp air. I picked one up, flipping it open with trembling hands. Inside were page after page of names, dates, and short notes. Thomas L., March 2017, answered. Warned him. Maria P., July 2018, rang twice. Didn't pick up. Ethan K., November 2018, picked up. Cried. The further I flipped, the worse it got. Dozens of entries, spanning years. Then I noticed some of the names matched obituaries I'd seen pinned upstairs. I dropped the notebook like it burned me. My flashlight beam trembled across the basement walls as I spun, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows. And then my phone buzzed again. Unknown caller. I nearly screamed. I didn't answer. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, heart slamming against my ribs. I burst out into the kitchen, lungs burning, throat dry. I didn't finish the job. I left everything, slammed the door shut, and drove until the woods were behind me. Back at the office, I filed a report saying the property was unsafe, possibly squatters. I didn't mention the calls, didn't mention the notebooks. No one would have believed me anyway. 2 days later, Another crew member named Aaron was sent to finish the job. That afternoon, my phone buzzed, a text from him. The phone in the bedroom rang. "What the hell is this place?" I called him immediately. His voice was shaky. He said he hadn't answered, said he'd locked the doors and left early. The next day, Aaron quit, packed his stuff, left without a word. Months later, I checked his Facebook. He was alive, fine, living in Kentucky, but he never spoke about the house again. Our boss eventually called the sheriff's office to report possible squatters. They searched the property. The report came back. No one inside. But even now, years later, I think about that place. About the clippings, the notebooks, the voice on the line warning me not to answer. I've been through hundreds of houses since then. None of them left a mark like that one. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm half asleep, my phone buzzes. I glance at the screen, heart climbing into my throat. Because every once in a while it says unknown caller, and I don't answer. This happened in 2021. I was 28 at the time, living alone in a small rental house in Cedar Hill, Missouri. The place sat on a quiet, dead-end street at the edge of town, surrounded by woods on two sides. It wasn't fancy, just an older single-story house with scuffed hardwood floors, drafty windows, and a yard that looked more like a patch of weeds than grass. But the rent was cheap, and it had a basement, which I figured would be useful for storing tools, boxes, and old furniture I hadn't gotten around to selling. I moved in during early summer, and for a while everything seemed normal. The house had its quirks. Sometimes the pipes rattled when I flushed the toilet, the screen door banged in the wind if I forgot to latch it, and one of the kitchen cabinets never stayed shut. Little things you expect from a house built in the 1960s. The only part that gave me pause was the basement. The door to it was at the end of the hallway, across from the bathroom. The door was unusually heavy, like it had swollen in the frame over the years, and the knob stuck whenever I tried to open it. The light switch was halfway down the stairs, not at the top. That meant each time I went down, I had to take 3 or 4 steps into total darkness before I could flip it on. The first time I went down there, I felt a strange weight in my chest. Not outright fear, just unease. The single overhead bulb barely lit the center of the room, leaving the corners drowned in shadow. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mold, like wet wood left too long in the rain. I told myself it was just an old basement, no worse than any other. I stacked my boxes along one wall, leaned a few extra chairs and a dresser against another, then shut the door and didn't think much of it. A few months later, around late October, things changed. I work nights as a delivery driver for a warehouse, usually getting home sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. One night I came in exhausted, dropped my keys on the counter, and headed toward the bathroom before bed. That's when I heard it. A faint knock. 3 soft taps, muffled, coming from behind the basement door. I froze. At first I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes, or the house settling. But as I stood there, holding my breath, the sound came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I backed a few steps away and stared at the door, waiting, heart hammering in my chest. But after that silence, I whispered to myself, "It's just the house." Though I didn't really believe it. I didn't open the door. Instead, I went straight to my bedroom, locked the door, and stayed awake for hours with the TV on, listening for any other sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep. The next morning, in daylight, I decided to check. I opened the basement door, crept down the steps, and flicked on the switch. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Boxes stacked neatly, old chairs against the wall, dust untouched. No footprints, no broken windows, no sign anyone had been down there. I convinced myself it had been the house shifting in the cool night air, or maybe even a raccoon in the walls. But a few nights later, it happened again. This time I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom. Just as I turned off the faucet, I heard it. A single knock, not 3 taps. Just one, but it was loud, sharp, deliberate, like someone rapping their knuckles hard against the basement door. I froze, toothbrush still in hand, foam in my mouth. Slowly, I pushed open the bathroom door. The hallway was empty. The basement door was shut. I walked closer and pressed my ear against the wood. For a moment, I heard nothing but the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Steady. As if someone were standing just on the other side. Waiting. I stumbled back and hurried to my bedroom, slamming the lock. that night I barely slept. The next morning, I called my landlord, a guy named Dennis. I told him I thought someone might have broken in and was hiding in the basement. He sounded skeptical, almost amused, but said he'd come by. When he arrived, we went down together. He checked every corner, every window, and even the foundation vents. Everything was intact. No signs of a break-in, no animal droppings, nothing. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Old houses make noises, don't let it get in your head." But I knew what I'd heard. For about a week, things were quiet. I almost convinced myself Dennis was right, that maybe I'd been overtired and imagining things. I was working long hours after all. Then, one night around 2 a.m., I was watching TV in the living room when I heard it again. Not a knock, not a thud, a creak. The sound of the basement door opening. Slow, drawn out, unmistakable. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The hinges groaned, inch by inch, like something was deliberately pushing the door open. I stood up and peered down the hallway. My stomach dropped. The basement door was wide open. I hadn't touched it in over a week. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and inched toward the doorway. My heart was hammering, every step heavy. I didn't have a weapon, but I had to know what was happening. I stood at the top of the basement stairs and shone the light down. The bulb wasn't on. The basement was pitch black. I reached around the corner and flicked the switch. Nothing. The bulb had burned out. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Coming up the stairs. My breath caught. My hands trembled. I slammed the door shut and gripped the handle. For a second I felt pressure from the other side, as if something were leaning against it. Then it stopped. I locked the door and called the police. My voice shook as I told them someone was in my basement. 2 officers arrived about 10 minutes later. I met them in the yard, refusing to step back inside until they did. They swept the house first, then went into the basement. I stood outside, waiting, every second dragging like an hour. Finally, they came back up. Their faces were calm, almost bored. "Nobody down there," one of them said. "No sign of forced entry. Nothing disturbed. You sure you weren't half asleep?" I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. They left, and I stood alone in the front yard staring at that house, afraid to go back inside. When I finally did, I locked every door and window and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I bought a heavy padlock and installed it on the basement door. I didn't care if the landlord complained. I needed it. For the next few weeks, nothing happened. No knocks, no creaks. I let myself relax. I started to believe maybe the lock had solved it. Then one night, I got home and froze in the hallway. The basement door was open. The padlock lay on the floor, twisted and broken. I hadn't touched that door in weeks. For the first time, it hit me. Every knock, every creak, every sound. It always happened at night. Always when I was alone. I didn't go down. I couldn't. I packed a bag, drove to a friend's apartment, and stayed there for 3 days. When I came back, I nailed the basement door shut. Literally. I hammered nails into the frame and shoved a chair against it for good measure. I didn't care how it looked. I just couldn't stand to see that door. A few nights later, around 3 in the morning, I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard something that froze me in place. A voice. Not clear words, not even loud, just a faint rumble, like the low vibration of vocal cords. It came from directly beneath me, from under the floorboards, from the basement. That was it. I called the police again. They searched the house, found nothing, and left shaking their heads. I didn't stay another night. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove away, leaving most of my furniture and all the boxes in the basement behind. I didn't even bother to tell Dennis. I just left the keys on the counter. I don't know what was down there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake in my new apartment, I think back to that house in Cedar Hill, and I wonder if I'd waited just a little longer that night, what would have come up those stairs?